Welcome back to Moby Dick. In this broadcast, we're going to go through chapters 2 through 5. As promised, I'm trying to pick up the pace a little. We start in chapter 2 with the carpet bag, and Ishmael is trying to find a cheap place to stay. We've established that his purse is empty, he's dead broke, and that's part of why he's going to sea. And he has arrived in New Bedford, discovering that he can't make it to Nantucket that day. He needs to wait for the weekend and grab the next little boat to Nantucket on Monday. Now, he could leave on a whaling voyage from New Bedford, but he wants to be a purist about this and leave from Nantucket. So he's going to find a cheap place to stay for a couple of nights and leave on Monday. He describes his wandering around New Bedford in the lyrical and, heavy-handed, shall we say, manner in which he approached Chapter 1 and the extracts. He uses lots of Christian imagery and lots of allusions. And the whole thing sounds very grand while it's still the beginning of the voyage. I want to take a moment to add some personal commentary here. It's become very fashionable to, just to diss the dead white man and the Christian imagery of Western literature, to deride it as being imperialist or pedantic or insensitive to minorities. I have a couple of issues with that. One is that the allusions that Melville uses in Chapter 2, for example, in the Euroclydon wind, or in the parable of Lazarus and Dives, not Dives, but Dives in the Latin, Melville's readers would have known what those stories are. Whether or not they themselves were Christians, they certainly would have spent enough time in church to know what these stories are. So he's not trying to be preachy. He is instead using these religious metaphors as a way of elevating his text. And it makes sense. It's not unnecessary. Ishmael is trying to understand his story and trying to not make it unique. He wants his story to be universal, because then it's not as scary. And this is something to think about in our own text. As we think of our own lives, we talk a lot about the importance of shared experience and the importance of finding others who respond the way that we do, so that we aren't so strange. In the treatment of PTSD, for example, veterans returning from war often find a great deal of solace in spending time with other veterans, because other veterans can validate the veracity of their experience in the way that civilians can't. There are things that we see in unusual circumstances that do not make sense to everyday life. And if we are not to think of ourselves as completely insane, we need to find other people who think like we do. I think that's what Ishmael is trying to do when he discusses either the Christian imagery or the ancient Greek imagery or references to myth and storytelling or even anecdote. He doesn't want to be the weird one here. And I think that's really important. So we go through these stories of Lazarus and Dives, and this ties in beautifully to the universal thump. At the end of Chapter 1, there's a great passage where Ishmael says, "Well then, however the old sea captains may order me about, however they may thump and punch me about, I have the satisfaction of knowing that it is all right, that everybody else is one way or other served in much the same way, either in a physical or metaphysical point of view, that is. And so the universal thump is passed round, and all hands should rub each other's shoulder blades and be content. So it's kind of serious here, right? In other words, you don't know what someone else's life is like. Their circumstances might be different, but rest assured that everyone gets knocked around by fate. In the story of Lazarus and Dives, he brings that up again. On page 12, this is at the end of chapter 2, Ishmael says, "But what thinks Lazarus? Can he warm his blue hands by holding them up to the grand northern lights? Would not Lazarus rather be in Sumatra than here? Would he not far rather lay him down lengthwise along the line of the equator? Yea, ye gods, go down to the fiery pit itself in order to keep out this frost. Now that Lazarus should lie stranded there on the curbstone before the door of Dives, this is more wonderful than that an iceberg should be moored to one of the Moluccas. Yet Dives himself, he too lives like a czar in an ice palace made of frozen sighs, and being a president of the Temperance Society, he only drinks the tepid tears of orphans." Which is another way of saying Lazarus can look in at the rich man, Dives, and assume that the rich man is going to be warm and safe from the cold and from the ice of the street, or in Ishmael's context, from the sidewalk trying to find a place to stay. But it would be naive to assume that the rich man himself isn't also suffering in some way. He only drinks the tepid tears. Now Ishmael blows this off at the end, the last paragraph of chapter 2, and says, "But no more of this blubbering now. We are going a-whaling, and there is plenty of that yet to come." So he's trying to lighten the mood. But the universal thump goes round. Now we go into chapter 3, the Spouter Inn, and we get into some great comedy here. Ishmael's trying to find a place to stay. And he walks into the Spouter Inn, and he's told that there isn't any room, but he can share a bed. He can share a bed with a harpooner, whom we soon learn is our beloved Kikig. And, that's how he can get out of the cold. Ishmael doesn't know what to think about this. He doesn't really want to share a bed with another guy. He thinks that's pretty weird. But it's cold, and it's uncomfortable, and how bad can it really be? So he allows himself to go into this room, and here in chapter 3, we first meet Kikig, which is delightful. It's very funny. There's a lot of comedy about meeting the savage and having to share a bed with him. And in the description of this, Ishmael begins to offer some commentary on how it is that one decides what's civilized and what isn't. And at first it's very funny. There's the description of how one person dresses as opposed to doesn't, or the tattooing on the skin, and, well, any man can be honest in any skin. And finally, on chapter 5, he says, "A good laugh is a mighty good thing, and rather too scarce a good thing, the more's the pity. So if any one man, in his own proper person, affords stuff for a good joke to anybody, let him not be backward, but let him cheerfully allow himself to spend and be spent in that way. And the man that has anything bountifully laughable about him, be sure there is more in that man than perhaps you think for." Lest we still have the impression that Moby Dick is a terribly, terribly serious book, dealing with terribly, terribly serious ideas, and it is, we should remember that it's also supposed to be funny. So while we talk about civilization and madness and the quest to reassure ourselves that our experiences are not singular or unique, in other words, that we aren't crazy, we should also remember to not take ourselves too seriously. It is funny, and we should enjoy the humor of it.